Hello, everyone, and welcome to PGTME's 5th Annual Lunchtime Lecture Series. My name is Emma James. I'm Vice President of Medical Affairs at Encoded Therapeutics, a biotech company developing gene therapies for CNS disorders. I'm also a longtime member of PGTME. And today I'm joined by Dr. Barry Byrne, Dr. Liza Johnson, and Andrew McFadyen, who will introduce themselves shortly. Today's event is going to feature a brief introduction by our panelists, followed by a moderated discussion. We've also allowed at least 15 minutes for audience Q&A at the end, and we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A feature throughout the panel. We're grateful to have you all here for our 5th year of hosting this event. We're always really impressed and inspired by the diverse group of attendees and the thoughtful engagement that we get. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics, housed in NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Department of Population Health, and it's funded in part by a gift from Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. You can learn more about PGTME on our webpage, and John will drop the link into the chat. And you can join our mailing list to receive our quarterly newsletter to keep up with our work. We're very excited to hear from today's speakers on the topic of balancing risk and benefits, gene therapy across diverse diseases. In this session, we will explore how variability between diseases impacts gene therapy development. So this may include rapidly fatal versus longer prognosis, younger children versus adolescents, diseases with existing treatment options or not, and factors to consider for either clinical trials or commercially available therapies. We'll be posting captioned recordings for the whole week's sessions once the week has concluded, and we'll share the link with all attendees. Without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and their work and the diseases that they're describing in terms of the age of onset, progression, and the stages of available treatments. So Andrew, let's start with you, please.
Well, thanks very much, Emma. I'm Andrew McFadyen. I wear a lot of hats. I wear a lot of hats when I do panel presentations like this and in our work with PGTME. I will start by saying I am one of the founding members of PGTME, and I've been working alongside Emma and team for a very long time on issues related to the ethics of pediatric gene therapy. I have spent 20 years in the patient advocacy space, running 2 rare disease patient advocacy organizations that look at helping patients navigate and access medicines either in the pre-approval stage or sort of access clinical trials or available treatments and therapies, et cetera. Through that role, we've funded a lot of research, a lot of gene therapy projects that are currently in clinical trial as well. And all of that began when my son was diagnosed with a very rare disease called mucopolysaccharidosis type 6 when he was just 18 months old. So I have an advocacy hat I can wear, a researcher hat I can wear, a parent hat I can wear. And just recently, I rolled into the Hospital for Sick Children as the ethics lead for the new precision child health movement that we have at the Hospital for Sick Children. So I'm doing a lot of ethics work, looking at frameworks for N-of-1 treatments, et cetera. So happy to be here, happy to be involved with my fellow panelists, and looking forward to today's discussion. Oh, the disease area that we'll touch on a lot. I think we'll stick with sort of the MPS diseases today, although we've looked at a lot of different diseases and we've launched a lot of clinical trials. We'll stick with MPS diseases. Traditionally, access to medicines at a very early stage, looking at enzyme replacement therapies. There's ERTs, but there's also gene therapies that are in clinical trial or about to be approved.
Wonderful. And don't feel constrained to stick to only MPS if necessary.
Liza.
Hey, good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Dr. Liza-Marie Johnson. I'm a pediatric blood and cancer doctor at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, and also a bioethicist and clinical researcher. My sort of disease today is going to be sickle cell disease. I've been working kind of using a community-based approach to design educational materials about treatment options for sickle cell disease. So we've worked with a lot of parents of children with the disorder, patients who have sickle cell disease from around the United States, and have a lot of information from listening to them as stakeholders. I will sort of shamelessly say we have a gene therapy study that we're interviewing people who've been through gene therapy or who are interested in gene therapy but declined or were not eligible for sickle cell disease. So if you know someone that we should interview, please reach out to me. And I'm excited to be part of this panel today and share some of what we've learned from our patients and families.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liza. And Barry.
Thanks, Emma, for including me in this panel, and thanks to PGME to putting together this thoughtful series. So I'm excited to participate. I'm the director of the Gene Therapy Center at the University of Florida. At University of Florida, AAV vectors were first discovered 30 years ago, and we've continued to develop both basic science knowledge about manufacturing these products to increase availability. So some of the topics we'll discuss on today are access, and also to understand better safety issues that are surround systemic use of gene therapy in particular, that influences the risk-benefit discussion. So we've been very involved in some of the topics that will be discussed today. Glad to be here.
And Barry, can you just talk a little about the kind of therapy areas you're representing?
Yeah, my clinical area is in cardiology, but most of that is centered in forms of pediatric heart failure that are impacted by childhood neuromuscular diseases. So my topic area will be mostly related to neuromuscular, and this is part of my role as the Chief Medical Advisor of the Muscular Dystrophy Association.
Thank you. So taking a sort of 60,000-foot view, and maybe Andrew, I'll start with you, but Barry and Liza, feel free to chime in afterwards. From the patient and family perspective, how do we go about balancing hope versus hype for gene therapies in the context of no therapies and in the context of other therapies existing at the same time as they're being developed? Do you think there should be a difference in how we approach it?
I mean, that's such a difficult first question to ask on a panel like this. The idea of hope versus hype. It all begins, basically for patients and families with that initial press release that goes out from pharmaceutical companies or from investigators, et cetera, saying, oh, innovative, new, potentially curative, and they're targeting investors at that early stage, but it's patients and families that sort of are able to key in on those news releases and the press clippings, et cetera. And they believe that hope that they've been looking for has arrived. They see those terms cure, they see those terms innovative, they see those terms, accelerated approval and that sort of thing. And they do get this sense of finality, that those cures have arrived, et cetera. For us, I mean, from a parent perspective, we're from that first generation where we were just starting to get enzyme replacement therapies. We were just starting to get at least some type of treatment for us. And for us, we believed that was our greatest hope. And we knew at the time it wasn't curative. We always said that this is our lifeboat until we can find those cures. And getting on enzyme replacement therapy at an early age did provide that lifeboat. I think looking at gene therapy, everybody says it's a one and done. It's the curative approach, et cetera. And we're starting to discover through clinical trials, through some of the available gene therapies that are out there, that there may be waning benefit over time. We need redosing, et cetera. I'll tell you that we sort of, in the gene therapy that we funded, we thought we were getting in at the highest dose. We'd had access to this data for the longest time. It came in through our organization. We saw where they were at. Isaac's going to be enrolled. We're going to get in at the highest dose, and we're going to reach our mission of even myself thinking we're going to cure my son. And after his data came in, we realized we needed to double that dose again, and he needs to be redosed at some point because the efficacy just isn't where we need it. So I think that if there's no therapies, I think that for patients and families in today's day and age, if there are no therapies available, I think that the risk benefit analysis changes a lot. But if you are currently in a position where you have enzyme replacement therapy, you're in that lifeboat, you feel like things are stable over time, the thought process to go into that gene therapy trial or even switch over to an approved gene therapy is a lot different than it used to be in the past. And so it's a great topic. It's a great topic for this type of panel.
Thank you. And I guess Liza or Barry, going on from that, how do you think the disease severity affects the risk tolerance and the efficacy expectations Do people think about this, as physicians differently for, early phase studies versus approved therapies?
Liza, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I guess, if I can quickly add a comment about hope and hype. I think we sort of have a little bit of a, professional obligation that we can sort of foster hope, but we have to be careful about fostering hype, and having kind of our own therapeutic misconception. If you think about palliative care and, children who are dying, parents hope their child will find a cure. They hope the phase 1 trial, or they hope their child will survive. And, we can honor that sort of hope. We also then ask what else they're hoping for. And so I think, people can be hopeful with these gene therapies, but I think, and some of it comes, as, Andrew said, the media, these like crazy terms like curative, transformational, amazing, and so kind of the expectations, we needed to maybe level set when we talk to our patients. And, I didn't say this when I introduced myself, but I'm a former IRB chair. And so, people come to me and it's like, but my patient needs this therapy. They have to have this therapy. And I'm like, it's a phase 1, it's a dose finding study. Like, I realize you're passionate about it, but, they need the treatment. And so, they even mix up their words with patients and families. And so I guess to answer your second question now quickly, gene therapy for sickle cell disease, the clinical trials enrolled patients with severe sickle cell disease. And, I think there's plenty of patients with severe disease. Someone whose disease is well controlled, probably is not, not going to put them through sort of the intensity that is involved, unless they're sort of really interested and you've had a thorough informed consent. So I do think disease severity matters in those conversations. Barry?
Yeah, I completely agree that certainly early onset fatal conditions, the risk benefit equation changes. I think one of the biggest challenges for us as medical providers is to, as it was said, to level set the expectation. I think when the expectation doesn't meet the reality is when people are disappointed. And so it's appropriate to be circumspect and truthful and direct about what's not known and what's known, and what best expectations we can provide to patients and their families about the future and the potential for benefit. And that's the basis of any beyond minimal risk treatment, that there has to be a prospect of direct benefit to that individual. It's part of the regulatory framework that we work in, and while in adult conditions, that's adequate to provide informed consent about when there's not certainty about that aspect. But in pediatric clinical studies, that has to be at least reasonably well understood, and I think we have to communicate that to families. So yes, it certainly, people will do anything, and there are other consequences too of their willingness to help support the health and well-being of their children. That sometimes are financial considerations. They would provide any support they can to get to effective therapy. They travel, they miss work, they sacrifice time with their other children. So there are many aspects of its treatment paradigm that are influenced by severity.
And
Okay.
I'll finish up with some of the lexicon that we use when we're talking about this idea of hope. Oftentimes, and this isn't a reminder for my panelists, it's mostly for the people that are participating in this call. Oftentimes in the patient world, we hear this idea of false hope. And that's a trigger word. I often say, let's not use that term false hope. Let's use misguided hope, because that still doesn't sort of take that idea of hope away from a family, because sometimes hope is all you have left, especially when you're dealing with these very devastating conditions. And so misguided hope means that maybe we could perhaps redirect to something that's a little bit more beneficial, some adjunct therapies, again, some lifeboats, until sort of that better solution can come along.
That's a great point. And I guess moving from that, and Liza mentioned the use of the word cure and transformative. A question to Barry, in the context of gene therapies, how do you think when we have all of this expectation over the potential benefits that people hope to see, how do you think this single administration affects the sort of the ethics and the hopes of approving therapies that are perhaps only moderately effective versus that transformational or curative that people have always been hoping for? And do you think this affects potential innovation for future improved therapies? And how do we think about doing something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been the focus of work we've been doing for the past 8 years now, realizing that certainly in early onset diseases, which accompany the more severe mutations that lead to timing of onset and severity, particularly in neuromuscular disorders, because of the biology of skeletal muscle growth, we know that earlier treatment, although may be more beneficial in arresting or preventing the onset of the disease, will lead to less durability. And so we've felt for a while that there has to be a consideration of prospective management of the potential for a future therapeutic. What's one option that may be improved through various learnings from the early stage clinical trials, or you could change the paradigm from the one and done concept where the field has been willing to accept the maximally tolerated dose, which is the really limit of safety, which becomes a problem if we are constantly bumping up against the safety limits based on the exposures that have come with the early studies. We could reframe that and consider that incremental dosing may have some advantages, but then we're obliged to manage the immune responses early on. So there are many, other drug therapies where it's common practice to change the dosing interval or frequency to balance the toxicities. And I think we can do that in the gene therapy space. It also potentially redefines the way pivotal studies are done, because you could conduct a within subject dose crossover study, which allowed every participant to receive the most efficacious dose and not relegate any participants to the minimally effective dose or the early stage cohorts. And I think patient community is now very sophisticated about this. I've received inquiries about even clinical trial participation studies that we're not involved in, on the notion that there'll be an opportunity for access to a different commercial product later. This is a major topic now in the Duchenne arena, where there's one approved product and many others in development.
Yeah. Can I guess, continue on that vein for a moment and ask your opinion on how sponsors and regulators then should think about the situation with investigational therapies that potentially in some children or adults, but show considerable efficacy, but where they also have a significant risk of death. But there are no other treatments available. From a developer perspective, how do we think about that? And then maybe Barry, if you can start, and then Andrew, I'd love to know your thoughts on, how the mortality really affects what patients are willing to undertake, and how should clinicians and industry and regulators all think about that. But maybe Barry, if you go first.
I can maybe use as an example where we are today with X-linked NPM1, a congenital myopathy that causes severe weakness and respiratory insufficiency due to a centronuclear myopathy. So there was a product developed based on an AAV8 vector in which, sadly, at the high dose cohort and one individual in the low dose cohort developed a degree of liver toxicity associated with the treatment that led to fatalities. And so when that was being considered about how to continue and reach a registrational trial to improve access, now whereas many of the participants had significant benefit, but yet there was this, a very high risk associated with it. And the question was posed to the patient community and to advisors to, is this risk acceptable? And should that just be baked into the approach to the disease. And there were two aspects that I learned from that. One is that some elements of the patient community said that risk was acceptable. But there is another part of it, that there's a provider involved as well. And so it was never considered by the sponsor, in fact, what the impact of the provider on the providers were, and the medical care team. When there is a fatality in a study, it's devastating not only to the family, but also to the provider group that are often really, they're kind of family members in a way. They get very invested with families and linked to them, and it's devastating on both sides. So ultimately, the advice was that wasn't acceptable risk level, and they pivoted to a more effective approach that's not reached the clinic yet, but where the risk profile is expected to be lower. And I think that was influenced by a more definitive stance from the patient community and providers that the level of risk the sponsor proposed was not acceptable. So that's a real world example. And I think we'll see that have played out in other conditions where either the route of administration, the dose, the type of AAV vector that was used have been associated with unnecessary risk.
And I'll follow up on that. Yeah, I mean, you're right. That patient community is becoming more understanding of what risk is. There used to be sort of this thought process that the more severe the condition, the higher risks that people would take for as long, going to the far end of the spectrum. And in my world, it's pediatrics, of course, and it's parents consenting to this. So it's parents consenting on behalf of their children who are obviously very, very young. And in my world, it's often parents that have raised large sums of money to even get that research, project off the ground and provided. And so you run into these issues like, can a parent, and I include myself, can that parent even provide appropriate informed consent when they've invested so much time and effort and money and, flipping burgers for a profit of $20 to put back into that research project over time, and having a broader sense of risk, talking to the providers as well, but about risk is vitally important. We also know another thing: if there's a death in one project, the ripples throughout the entire gene therapy and research community it can be catastrophic. We look way back to the death of Jesse Gelsinger and sort of the halting of all gene therapy approaches, et cetera. But even now, there's a death or an adverse event. Our emails blow up. Hey, did you see this? What does this have? Does this have implications for your future research, your project, the project that your kids are waiting for, the project that sort of you're advising and overseeing, et cetera? So we all have to take responsibility to understand and recognize that there are risks that are too much, even if you're dealing with very, very severe diseases.
Yeah, I would add, even just from the industry perspective, I think we spend a lot of time looking at what is happening in other gene therapy programs and trying to make sure that we apply those learnings to everything we're doing, even for ongoing clinical trials. I think the stakes are so high here that, and there's still relatively little experience, that I think every individual case adds so much to the overall understanding. Andrew and Liza, sorry. I guess starting with Liza, how do you think that the patients sort of weigh the severity or the nature of their diseases when considering gene therapies versus other treatments? And then Andrew, sort of going back on to what you just mentioned just now, how do you think perhaps adults would then consider their own therapies versus when they are trying to choose something for their own child as a parent, and how do those views differ? But Liza, maybe you go first.
Yeah, so this is a topic that we're hoping to explore further with our participants. But when we interviewed about 55 parents of children, infants, toddlers, up to parents of adolescents. And we asked them what they knew about gene therapy, and most of them knew very little, although after the 2 gene therapies were approved, FDA approved for sickle cell, more people said yes, but they had really a superficial knowledge. And we asked them, would you like you know, after this interview, would you like to be connected with someone who can give you more information? And almost everyone said yes. And then we read them a little bit of a blurb about the intensity of treatment, the time commitment, the risk for future infertility, the potential for death. And we had several parents say, no, never mind. No one needs to sort of call me and tell me more about gene therapy, because their perception of their child's illness was that it wasn't severe enough to warrant the risks associated with the gene therapy. A lot of parents also expressed hesitation about making a decision for their child that would impact their sort of future sort of autonomy. So for example, choosing a treatment that would make their son or daughter likely infertile, they felt that like the child should decide for themselves when they reach the age of majority. And so if you think about, you know, for those of you who don't know, if you decide to undergo gene therapy for sickle cell disease, your stem cells are mobilized. So you receive a medication called plerixafor usually. And we try to get the stem cells sort of out of the bone marrow and sort of they can be collected and modified. Because the bone marrow of patients with sickle cell disease is sort of chronically inflamed, we often cannot get enough cells with one collection. So some patients have to undergo multiple cycles of this. It usually precipitates a pain crisis. You know, you get a pheresis catheter placed, like it's very burdensome. And then assuming you get to the point where you have enough cells to have the whatever type of gene therapy product, clinical trial, or, you know, whether it's a lentiviral or CRISPR, then you get admitted to the hospital to a transplant unit and you get intensive myeloablative chemotherapy. So it's like a bone marrow transplant, and then you have your cells infused. And so it's a lot. So if you have very severe sickle cell disease and you're frequently in the hospital for pain crises or acute chest, or you've been intubated multiple times, you know, your current risks of life are probably closer to some of the risks of gene therapy, and you might be more willing to take on those risks. If you're a college student and you have a couple of pain crises a year and you're taking your oral hydroxyurea medication, you're probably less interested in putting your life on hold for 6 months for something. And so I think parents, and I think young adult patients, I think they really sort of think about, you know, they're weighing their current like disease control versus, you know, this may be potentially transformative, but as one of our patients said, it's like they're going to put you through hell and it might kill you to get there. And so, you know, people kind of think, do I want to get on that bridge or not? And we're finding a lot of people do not want to get on the bridge.
Interesting.
And that sort of rolls into the question that you asked me, and I'll put my dad hat on for this one. That's what we're finding within our own family. You know, we provided consent for Isaac. And for those of you that don't know, we didn't just sort of participate in this clinical trial. We uprooted everybody and moved to Italy for 6 months. And so learning a new language, being immersed in a new culture. My other son obviously came with us. That's just who we are as a unit. He missed the first half of his grade 8 year and did most of it online back before we even knew that you could do these sort of things online. And, you know, we provided that consent. Isaac was 14 at the time, and so was very involved, heavily involved in sort of that decision-making. When we came back and over time, you know, he's turning 16, we're getting results back in, he's turning 18, he's reconsenting himself into long-term follow-up, et cetera. You know, I remember the day that I said, well, you know, listen, Isaac, that data looks like we need to redose you. At some point in time, probably some point soon. And maybe we should be refocusing our research efforts into ensuring that redosing is a possibility for people that are in the lower end of sort of that dose escalation studies and that sort of thing. And maybe we get back to work on our fundraising and reconnecting with researchers. And Isaac stopped me and said, whoa, Dad, I don't know if I'd do it. And I was just like, I was taken aback. Like our entire life mission was to find this cure and to have this conversation with my adult son who said, I don't know if I would do it. You know, it makes you step back to understand that he's now in first year university. He's in third year university right now. He's done a very successful co-op program where he's worked for the Ontario government for 2 sessions in a row, making probably more money than I'm making with a, you know, a government job type thing. He's got his own little apartment that he's set up with in our house and still sort of with us. Life for him is pretty good, even though he has a very, very severe form of the disease with 3 very significant spinal cord decompression surgeries. Many know that we almost lost him 7 years ago, and he spent a long stint in the ICU. For him, quality of life is really great. And that idea of us uprooting again and putting things on hold and impacting other lives all went into sort of that decision. Now, these decisions for adults do evolve and change. And as sort of disease sort of progresses a little bit more, I was just told literally last week when I was having a conversation about somebody like this, that his thought process has once again changed. And yes, he would undergo a redose. And so they do have sort of those moments of critical thought. And as life evolves and as life changes and as disease changes, those decisions change. But as parents, I think we need to understand that when we're providing that consent, we need to also sort of think of long-term investment for our children. And it may not be what you think it is in that sort of long-term. They may have different ideas of what it is. And so again, it all comes down to great communication with your healthcare providers, with your team, and with advocacy groups, making sure that expectations are there for everybody so that they can make informed decisions.
Great, thank you. And I guess that leads me to a question about informed consent. I think we're all familiar with the extensive informed consent documents, you know, the families have to read and understand during the research process, and physicians have to make sure that they read and understand them. Can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of the consent process that happens once a product has been approved? And how does that differ to that research setting? Yes, that's Liza or Barry, probably.
You know, we generally, if someone's interested in gene therapy or a potentially transformative treatment, we'll have an introductory visit that's about an hour long. And we have 2 clinicians who do that, and they generally will talk about bone marrow transplant or gene therapy, and try to sort of answer a lot of questions. But some of those colleagues who do that kind of, there's like information overload, right? You know, because if you think about, people have very sort of limited knowledge about what they're about to hear. They sort of come in and like their eyes are glazing over, you know, 20 minutes in, even if they're trying to be interactive and engaging. And so, you know, for my other previous work, we've sort of shown that like having an informational sheet or having a stage consent process and multiple visits is sort of optimal. Unfortunately, you know, the way that our US healthcare system works, people don't get paid to have, you know, 4 different 1-hour consent sessions. I think there's probably a role, you know, something in a future project to having some sort of like parent navigator, you know, or disease navigator, who can sort of help with the translation. One of our projects is we've created a website. We hope it will be live around February 1st, myscdstory.org. And it has 5 the different treatment options. And it's like a choose your own adventure, and you can follow a patient, Nia, for 20 years, depending whether she does medication, transplant, gene therapy. And so I think innovative approaches to informed consent are needed. And, you know, reminding people that it is not just the form and signing the permission slip as you will, but it's like ongoing conversations about what to expect. You know, we had one family in a study share, it's like they remember their doctor wrote on the, you know, the paper that's on the exam table. The doctor wrote all this stuff and like would tear it off and hand it to them. And after their son completed therapy, this was an oncology patient, you know, they had all of the notes that were written, you know, sort of on the exam room paper. So tailored to sort of the people's needs, but I do think we sort of need to do a better job. If anyone hasn't read the New York Times, there's a series of articles the New York Times has put out about the first patient to receive commercial gene therapy, I think at Children's National. I think there's been 2 or maybe 3 stories. The most recent one was when the patient was leaving the hospital and his family sort of said, you know, yes, the informed consent form talked about mortality and sort of this thing called mucositis. They were like, but we were totally unprepared for what our son went through. And that's what we're hearing in our own study where we're interviewing people who've been through gene therapy. They were like, I had no idea how intense the chemotherapy would be. I had no idea how bad I would feel. So I don't know exactly, but there's still opportunity. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, the consent process is an important time to take the opportunity to educate the family, and but we also have to remember the informed consent is actually a contract. It's an agreement between the participant or the patient in the case of a commercial product and the providers. And so there's expectations built into that, at least when it's a research participant. There are a lot of details about financial obligations, participation in what's required, and what it means to not participate. That becomes less stringent in the context of the commercial therapy, but really the risk-benefit profile is not changed at all, depending on whether the sponsor is paying or the commercial insurance is paying. So we actually take a very similar approach to informed consent in the commercial space as we do for research participants. Because there's a lot we don't know about the long-term benefits and long-term follow-up needs, every commercial patient we follow, whether it's for SMA or Duchenne, also participates in an observational study in which they sign a more detailed research consent, if they agree, to collect additional data about efficacy and adverse events. So, but we try to take that as an opportunity to teach as much about the therapy, the known and unknown parts as possible. And in collaboration with the MDA, which sponsored a program in gene therapy readiness for various sites around the country that may have had less experience in the research realm, we have a number of patient-facing educational documents that are multilingual. So those are available through the MDA website under the gene therapy readiness section. And that's the way we approach it, as much information as we can do in a staged fashion. I think this is a great point. No one really can absorb this in a half an hour, 1 hour session, because it's drinking from a fire hose. So it's not possible. So we do an introductory when there's a candidate for such a treatment, and we have the initial conversations to avoid having them to travel just for a 1 hour meeting. Because they come from a wide area, we'll do a Zoom visit and we'll provide all those documents for them to think about. Then we'll do another Zoom visit, and then we schedule the in-person visit. So it is staged in that way. And it's only at the in-person visit when you can kind of read the nuances of the level of understanding, because there's not a quiz, right? We have to gauge the level of understanding and acceptance by talking to people directly. And it's also hard when there are language barriers.
Yeah.
So we had one situation where we had native Spanish-speaking providers and investigators in the study that consented a study participant, this is almost 20 years ago, in Spanish, who was traveled from Mexico just to receive this treatment for their son. And there was a appropriate conversation, seemingly level of understanding. And then ultimately this treatment was not effective. And years later, their son passed away. And we learned only then that the dialect of Spanish they spoke meant that they actually understood nothing about what was consented in the beginning. And that didn't become clear until much later, because they didn't want any barrier of their level of understanding or their own language to limit access. So they went along with everything that was said, acknowledging and agreeing, but they really didn't understand. And so that was a lesson to me, that we have to go a little bit beyond just the head nodding and affirmative. And we ask sometimes questions and ask that the patients read and agree to this, in a sense, a contract that we have with them, what their expectations are.
Barry, you used the term contract twice there. Do you think that the families understand that that's how you perceive the document to be, that this is a contract? Or do you think it's something that they just...
It's certainly the way the IRS views the consent document, because it has to be in agreement with the sponsored research agreement associated with the study. So yes, it's a legal document. As well as in the commercial realm, that is an agreement that we have with the family, that it's often more brief in the commercial setting than when there's a sponsored study. But you know, it's basically a means to have a level of understanding of what the expectations are from both sides. Because, for example, if a patient suspects that they could receive this treatment, which is perceived as a lifelong therapy, and they have the treatment period and they go away and never come back, there's a risk to them and to us really understanding the longevity and effectiveness of the treatment if we never see that patient again. So that's why we say, what's the expectation about participating, receiving the therapy? And it's all language that's been borrowed from the transplant knowledge. So, 30 years of solid organ transplant, we really learn how to approach these things. And there's a lot of similarity between gene therapy and transplant. They're really two medical therapies that cannot be reversed once provided. So
yeah. Is Andrew, just quickly to you on that, do you think that the community understands the sort of the seriousness of that process?
Yeah, I do. I don't think they'd really sort of use the same language of contract, but I think they understand the idea of a reciprocal commitment to furthering research and long-term follow-up and that sort of thing. But patients and parents and family members go into this with a sense of hope for themselves, but also a sense of altruism for the advancement of this research, the potential to find cures, not only for their family, for their child, for themselves, but for the other people that are around them. In the rare disease community, we all know each other. We all love each other so dearly. We understand that somebody's going in for a gene therapy infusion, and we just want it to work so much for them as well, or those other family members that may not qualify due to pre-existing antibodies, et cetera. It's not like they don't want others to be able to gain this. And so I think that there is that sense of a shared commitment to advancing research, a shared commitment to the people that are providing access, to the principal investigators for the work that's going into it, of course. I don't think, in my experience with all the families that we've worked with over the course of time, I don't think they'd sort of drill it down to, we have this contract, to continue. But I do think that there is that long-term commitment that's given, not only for themselves but for others. So I do think that, yes, that expectation is there, and I think that it's a shared expectation. We want Barry to look after the health and well-being of our children, and we want to be able to make sure that we can also give back so that future knowledge is gained for future patient populations.
Thank you. Do we have a few? Sorry, go ahead.
Just want to interject that I don't mean to imply this is like a binding legal agreement that we would enforce. It's really an agreement that is so that there's mutual understanding. So in the sense of an IRB document, it is in fact a contract, but in the commercial world, it's really just an opportunity to educate families and provide some mutual understanding of what are their expectations and what are the provider's expectations to optimize the outcome.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So we have a few questions in the chat that I'm just going to start pulling on too. So one of them, this is for Barry. So Barry said, perhaps you mentioned that perhaps lower doses should be considered to avoid adverse events and then redosed, but you acknowledged the problem of immunogenicity. But obviously, this is a huge concern for this field. So do you see that as something that could be solved or overcome in the near future?
Yeah, we have one study underway in which there's a prospective management of the immune response in a way that allows randomized dosing and redosing within a 3-month period. And that's been done safely. So when it's said with some certainty that redosing is not possible, that's not really correct. What has to be determined is what is the window in which that is safe, and how much do we extend that immune management approach with pre-treatment. Following a previous treatment in which there are now high sustained antibodies, anti-drug antibodies against the vector, that's a bigger challenge. It involves some of the same elements involved in the prospective management of immune responses, but this is a lot of, again, learning from the transplant world. In the early days of transplant, when cyclosporin wasn't available, there were a lot of failures in solid organ transplant, and it's still not perfect in terms of rejection-free graft survival, but it's obviously been over the last 20 years evolved tremendously in terms of the level of understanding and what's required to balance the risk of infection versus the graft survival. And I think we have the same thing, at least related to anti-capsid immunity. Anti-transgene immunity, which occurs in cases where there are null mutations, none of the cause of the disease is a complete absence of the protein responsible for the disease. That's also very manageable now by liver-mediated tolerance induction. This has been demonstrated in the hemophilia studies where patients were enrolled in and received commercial therapy as well, who have inhibitors to factor VIII. And ultimately, over time, those inhibitors were eliminated by expression of factor VIII in hepatocytes. And we've seen the same thing be considered for other early onset myopathies. So I think it's possible. There are these two aspects, right? The capsid immunity and the issues around the transgene are both solvable. They're not in common practice, so it's fair to say this is still under investigation. But I don't think we should approach it by saying it's impossible. Then we would just never try. So I think that it's an area that we're actively involved in solving.
Great. And then another question. So could the panelists discuss the financial and other burdens, like moving to a foreign country for 6 months, that potentially put these therapies unequitably in the hands of patients? Is there a key difference between gene therapies and access to treatments like organ transplants? Maybe Liza, I can ask you to start.
Yeah, I think sickle cell is a little bit maybe different in the sense that it is sort of a chronic illness, with early mortality, and you sort of accumulate morbidity over time, but it's sort of not like a solid organ transplant where, as your organ function worsenings, you see the sort of progression towards death without having an organ. And similarly, if you need a bone marrow transplant for an oncologic process for refractory leukemia, you can't wait, or your leukemia will likely end your life. So it becomes a little bit kind of an elective decision, I think, which might be unique from a lot of the other disorders we're thinking about. And so I think, it's certainly not everyone can travel. But beyond that, we're asking someone to put their life on hold for at least 6 months. And people may have family obligations. They, yes, there's FMLA, but if then they don't have any income, so there are a lot of other sort of financial burdens, even if you have local access to such a therapy, and, family psychosocial sort of commitments. There's sort of a lot of stuff that goes into it. But I do think we need to be mindful that as therapies are developed, how can we ensure more equitable access, because if you're well educated, and you already have a great grasp of Google, and you use it regularly for information, you can probably find out about clinical trials and disease communities. And if you are, have a lot of, let's say you have a lot of food insecurity, and you live in a neighborhood with a high deprivation index, you are just probably trying to keep yourself and your family safe and figure out how you're going to eat, and not, researching, the latest and greatest. I'm not saying that people, can't do both things, but, we all only have so much bandwidth. And so I think we need to make sure we're not leaving people out, or making assumptions that they would be unable to commit to sort of aspects of the treatment or the clinical trial because of their difficult limited social support.
I'll add
Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, I can add, because we were one of those families that sort of did uproot and move, and it was difficult even for us, who sort of, both my wife and I could work from afar. We clearly were in a position that we could access the trial. We could, all leave as an entire family unit, et cetera. We recognized that those barriers were there. And if we were, as an organization, we paid for all of that, ourselves and looked after it ourselves. But we also understood that we had a responsibility as an organization that not only did we work to get this clinical trial off the ground and continued to fund it over the course of, 10 years, we needed to shift into making sure that it was accessible as well. And so, of the 9 first patients, 3 of them were Canadians. After us, we made sure that we paid for all travel and accommodation for those patients and families that were there. So that barrier was instantly removed. We booked all of their travel. We booked all of the accommodation. I felt like I was a travel agent for the longest time, making sure that flights were there, that things were organized with the clinical trial group, that appointments people were going to be on time, that family could fly over as well. And we were really proud of that from our organization, to be able to work to make sure that the decision-making process included the removal of those barriers of having to be, in Italy for that certain amount of time. When COVID came around, we had to shift to make sure that we could have sort of decentralized approach to follow up. And I think a lot of people were able to do that. We did have one family stranded in Italy during the height of COVID, and they weren't allowed to leave. And we, worked very hard to extend their accommodations, et cetera. But it is, I think there's a responsibility from those of us that are funding this research and trying to advance it, that we recognize those barriers and make it accessible, not just available to the select few, because we want to make sure that we're looking after the entirety of the patient population as best we can.
Great. Liza, last year, FDA approved a couple of different gene therapies for sickle cell in teenagers and above, but unrelated, Pfizer recently withdrew its oral compound for the same disorder. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how you as a physician, as well as the patient community, thinks about whether to take the gene therapy or alternative products, but also how the withdrawal of medications affects the community, because we've seen, especially in other countries, where companies have been unsuccessful in commercializing, and so it brings a lot of hope, and then potentially withdrawal of that hope to the community. So if you could just sort of share your thoughts on how that is received, and perhaps anything we can do to try and mitigate some of that.
Yeah, I think there's sort of 2 kind of issues there. I think, it gets also back to hope and hype. So I think in regards to sort of Pfizer's withdrawal of Oxbryta, voxelotor, there was sort of no advance notice to even DSMB sort of members. And so I think, I was talking to one of my research collaborators, they have a couple hundred sickle cell patients in Baltimore, and he thought maybe they had 4 patients on it. So a minority of patients were on the medication. But I think, I think we are, particularly in the sickle cell community, which in the United States is over 90% African American, and just broadly, I think we're suffering, with trust. Trust is decreasing in medical researchers and in healthcare institutions, and maybe in government. But anyway, we won't go there. We won't get political.
Different panel.
Yeah, different panel.
Friday.
And so I think it sort of undermines trust, because I know there's a couple of class action lawsuits. One, were you harmed by being on this medication? One that they shouldn't have just stopped, and then another one that's you shouldn't have just pulled it off the market. There are people that are benefiting from it. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, this was an oral medication that was what we would call disease-modifying therapy for sickle cell disease, sort of added on often to hydroxyurea, and it did help some patients. Pfizer was conducting clinical trials in Africa, and they had an excess number of participant deaths, but a lot of them were infection and malaria. So I think some people felt well, this isn't really applicable to many other settings. And so this is kind of an extreme response, and you could hypothesize it wasn't making them enough money, or that they had other reasons. But the fundamental issue is it undermines trust. I think that sickle cell is technically considered a rare disease, but it's maybe one of the more common rare disorders. Historically, it has received a lot less, it's one of the first monogenic disorders identified, but historically it's received a lot less funding than cystic fibrosis and some other common rare disorders. And I think, the community feels like, oh, well, we had more options. And now, we have these 2 new medications. There's another drug, crizanlizumab, that's been pulled off the market in Europe because it received early approval, but in the phase 3 trials, it wasn't any better than placebo. And so I think the mood is a little bit kind of low. And then, not to take up too much time, I think there are challenges related to the gene therapy. It's very expensive. The Bluebird product is $3.1 million per patient. The Vertex product is $2.2 million per patient. Anyone can't just decide that they want to administer this to patients. You have to negotiate with those sponsors to be an authorized treatment center. It's very onerous. So there's a lot of regulatory burdens, because of the high cost. If you become an approved treatment center, you have to, engage in a single patient insurance agreement with the person's insurer. And so, right, a lot of other insurers are trying to negotiate how that they would pay for this. The hospital has to pay up front and get reimbursed. And a lot of hospitals, can't just shell out $3.5 million and wait to see what they're going to get back, to treat multiple patients at once. And so I think there's maybe a little bit of disappointment because of the hype, like gene therapy is here. It's going to transform, it's going to cure sickle cell disease, and patients sort of aren't, really able to access it. There was just, the Beam base editing trial just had a participant death, right? And so I think these are all sort of things for the community that, patients are really sort of holding their breath and maybe feeling a little bit disappointed.
Great. And I guess you've already brought up the cost, but do you think there are other factors, and if so, what, that are impacting potentially slower than expected adoption of gene therapies following regulatory approval? Is there a different level of evidence required once it is in the commercial realm, or is there something else going on? And that question is to all of you.
Yeah, I guess I phoned a friend, a colleague, to find out where we stood, and my sense is that, since they've been approved, St. Jude, or a large academic medical center, has been negotiating to figure out how we were going to, with the 2 sponsors, to be able to offer these, and we aren't there yet, right? So we are able to offer gene therapy through the Beam trial, and St. Jude's going to be opening its own base editing gene therapy trial the end of this year, maybe January, I think the goal is. It's on clinicaltrials.gov. So I think that places just aren't up and running. And then, for the few that are, you have to go through the insurance process. And then, my colleague talked about a hot and cold decision. So, patients who are, having a lot of disease burden and a lot of crises, maybe just got out of the hospital, they're at their wit's end. They may say, yes, I want gene therapy. But then, you have to wait 4 months for your insurance company to approve it, and you're feeling a little better. And then you find out all the sort of time burdens. And then, you're kind of in that cold decision making, and you think, well, maybe not right now. And so I don't think there's anything sort of nefarious. I just think there's sort of the regulatory issue, and it's, they're expensive products. And I think it matters for the whole future of gene therapy, because how are we going to pay for these on scale as more therapies are developed, and who shoulders that burden?
Can I just probe on that a moment more? So if an insurance company agrees to pay, and then the person decides not to do it at that time, do they have to then go through the whole process to reapply again at a later date? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, sometimes the prior authorization is time limited, and if you can't schedule the patient within that time frame, you have to reapply. Okay. I mean, really, the payers want to do everything they can to limit their liability, and it may not be understood. Also, we're pointing out to the larger group here that some payers are very small plans, and that one payment of a $2 or $3 million product actually devastates the ability to pay for other therapies of those that are insured by the plan. So they rely on their own insurance, known as reinsurance. So in fact, sometimes the approval is challenging to get, because not only do you have to get the patient approved, but the insurer has to then also apply for reimbursement from their reinsurance. So those two contracts that come into play, and then there's a patient-specific agreement that has to be signed. So yes, it is sometimes time limited, often time limited. And then, if you waited too long, maybe the eligibility changes. So that has to be considered. We generally try to provide a 6-month window of eligibility once someone's authorized from a medical clearance perspective. I'm hoping that nothing changes. But if you kept testing for eligibility over that period, you might find that someone's criteria might change.
And I should add, at least for sickle cell, the cost is related to the gene therapy, but like the admission for the chemotherapy and all of that stuff is like a separate cost, a separate bill for their insurance, right? So it is actually more, and that's what some of the negotiating around becoming authorized treatment centers, and please, either of you guys feel free to correct me, as I understand it, is people are trying to get creative about reimbursements so that, like, if this doesn't work, will, Bluebird pay the insurer or the institution back some of the money? You know what I mean? Some sort of guarantee, as sort of, one way to think about it is when you buy an expensive house, you have a mortgage over 30 years. Most people aren't putting down millions of dollars in a cash payment. And sort of that's kind of what we're trying to figure out, because the health system isn't ready to put down millions of dollars in a cash payment. Is there like a mortgage system or some other way that we can come up with to finance these?
It's effectively a lease.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the questions or comments in the Q&A, sort of talks about the price again, and it says, from a social policy perspective, the cost may be warranted if the result is a cure and 40 years of life. But if the effect's going to wane over time, how often is a just and caring society required to continue to cover the cost of doing it repeatedly? Does any of you have any thoughts on that? It's a big question.
Constantly being reevaluated. I think that is exactly correct. And in single payer systems, where this all gets bundled in, it's a hodgepodge, right? In the UK, for example, there's one consideration. In France, in Canada, I learned that it's based on the province. It's not actually a federal level decision. In Spain, there are many regions where the costs are transferred to the treating hospital, and that hospital decides whether they're going to use some of their federal allocation for that therapy. And in the US, even though our system seems much more arcane than a single payer system, it actually has some advantages in that when someone becomes covered by Medicaid, there's an obligation to cover these therapies, even though they're able to negotiate the price. But if you have private insurance, they may deny therapy, even though you may, for some cases, get a full coverage. So it's very individualized, and the burden in some ways is on the provider to advocate for the patient to get authorization, because, as you said, sometimes when characteristics of a patient falls outside of the clinical trial population by age or functional characteristics, the payer will use that as the reason to say there's still an experimental therapy in the individual you're proposing for therapy, and it's denied. And then we appeal, and then the appeal can go to arbitration. But that is, there's no reimbursement for that activity either. So but we feel that's our obligation to patients to advocate for them through that process.
Okay. Thank you. So another one of the questions, going back sort of to the clinical trial setting. So how difficult is it for sponsors, investigators, and advocates to glean important factors used in other relevant gene therapy trials to try and avoid adversity or optimize safety? Would the space benefit from increased transparency? I have some thoughts on this, but I'll let you guys go first.
I think you should share your thoughts, because you're very, very experienced on this. So, Emma, I think you should take a stab at this one first.
All right. Well, I think, as I said, we spend a lot of time monitoring other companies, I think we're all aware of some recent deaths that occurred in the last couple of weeks, which was devastating to those of us working in the gene therapy space, even from the sponsor side. We care deeply about the work that we do. I think it can be very difficult to get hold of the information in a timely manner. We watch the press releases, we speak to people, who have information that they're able to share. We pore over the investor transcripts. We look at the information that's on clinicaltrials.gov and try and see what applies to what we're doing, and do we need to be making changes in a timely manner. I think some of the challenges are that companies are often doing their own investigations, and sometimes sharing information too fast can also be detrimental when they don't have full information to be able to share. It can cause a lot of anxiety. But then at the same time, those investigations often can take a very long time to complete, and then to get that into the public domain through publications, etc., can be an extremely laborious process. That means that it can be very difficult for sponsors to really learn in a real-time manner what is the critical information that needs to be incorporated into existing trials or future trials. There probably is more we as companies who have the information can do to sort of share that in a more timely manner. But when you look at both the publication practices, and then requirements to the SEC, etc., it can make that extremely complex. But I think we need to do more on getting that information out when there's clearly class effects happening that we need to understand better.
See, that was the perfect answer.
Anyone want to add to that?
I think that there is a need for greater transparency and sharing of information. I'm not totally sure the best way to sort of achieve that and protect participant privacy, particularly for these rare or small populations of disorders. I certainly, when I was IRB chair, we certainly had to modify the hemophilia gene therapy study, or one of our studies, based on something that was seen in an adult study, right? The FDA sort of said, you need to try to be monitoring more for this sort of toxicity and for participants in this study. So the FDA was sort of a coordinator of that. But, who knows what will happen in 2025 through 2029 in terms of the FDA's ability, and there's more gene therapies coming out. I mean, I can say I feel like I'm not breaking any rules, hopefully not, but the participant who died on the sickle cell Beam gene therapy trial was our participant. And I knew that case very well, and I saw the press release, and the press release, just sort of says that Beam announced there was a participant death. The FDA said the trial could continue with no changes, but like, what does that answer for anyone, who might have a question sort of about that? It doesn't really help the field at all. So I do think there sort of should be more, but I don't have the answer for how to do it.
I think it's just continuing on good relationships with patient advocacy groups, between PIs, between pharmaceutical sector, et cetera, so that sharing of information is a little bit easier. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes that information can't be shared, or sometimes that information that's out there, is completely wrong or completely misguided. I think we have a responsibility to try and continue to connect with each other as much as we possibly can in order to share with our patient community.
So I'll chime in that there are two levels here. One is after events occur, what level of transparency depends on what's material to the sponsor. So if this is an investigational agent. So if you're Pfizer and have hundreds of products in a multinational organization, a single patient fatality is actually not material. And even though they have been in 2 fatalities associated with Duchenne gene therapy, two being in the Pfizer studies, they've really been extraordinarily transparent, given that they were not obligated to. But if you're a early stage company with one clinical asset, that's absolutely material to the company, and there's an obligation to report. So there's a landscape. It's not a fair playing field in terms of transparency. But in fact, independent of what the sponsor does, investigators who are familiar with the FDA adverse event reporting system can on their own report adverse events. And this is very relevant in the commercial space. And unfortunately, because these products are not covered under a risk mitigation program, the REMS designation, there's not an obligation to report. But I think there's a ethical or moral obligation of investigators to be familiar, trained, and use the FAERS system of the FDA. It's the only way the agency has line of sight on these things. Otherwise, they might be considered disease-related or unrelated to the product, and we'll never learn unless these are reported in the public domain. And then there's a question about susceptibility, identifying risk factors in patients. Probably the best insight we would have into that is collecting genomic data on every participant in the gene therapy study. There are plenty of examples of that kind of data sharing. That genomic data is actually the patient's to share, and that can be de-identified, even though it's the most specific identifier we know of. But at least there are mechanisms for doing that and sharing that information into public databases that allow genomic researchers who can identify genome-wide associations, once there's enough patients, to identify risk factors that might change the risk-benefit profile for some participants or patients.
Thank you. And then probably the last question, the time's gone really fast. So one of the comments, so I'm so happy to hear the consideration of patient risk has evolved in the current gene therapy landscape. We're seeing both successes and serious challenges in AAV-based therapies. But in general, how do you feel we are progressing with increasing participant safety in recent trials, and how can we continue to proceed with greater care? Liza, maybe you could start.
Yeah, I think, to sort of Barry's point, I mean, these are small scale trials. So like we're just accumulating experience. And I think we have an obligation to try to be reflective on these experiences, these adverse events, the outcome, and sort of discuss them as a community. For our participant who died, we think that it was a combination of factors, and not the gene therapy itself. But what if it is the gene therapy itself, but it's going to occur in 1 out of 1,000, and we're nowhere near 1,000 people who've had gene therapy for sickle cell disease. And so I think we're going to learn things over time. And, we just have an obligation to pause and reflect and think critically about events and not just assume they're totally unrelated. And, if our friend calls us for advice, maybe we sort of kind of need to say, well, like, this is a little bit more detail, if it's relevant to their own clinical trial. Great.
Barry, anything to add? 20-second version?
No, I agree. We have to, we wrote a commentary a number of years ago before the even first fatality. It's when there are adverse events. The headline was safety first. If we don't have safety, these products will never be widely available. So it has to be the primary consideration.
Thank you. And Andrew, any closing comment?
No, that's heartening to hear as a patient and dad of a patient that desperately is looking for answers, but we want to do it in a safe process. So thank you for everybody.
Thank you all. So with that, we're out of time. I would like to thank our panelists for a great discussion today, and for all of the attendees for your thoughtful questions. Be sure to tune in for tomorrow's panel, which is Ethical Questions in Genetic Screening and Testing. A registration has been shared in the chat. And on behalf of PGTME, I'd like to thank all of you who've attended, participated, or helped put this webinar together. I know it's a huge lift. And I'd like to remind you that PGTME exists courtesy of charitable donations. So if you're interested in supporting the educational initiatives, please contact our co-chair, whose name and email addresses have been shared in the chat. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day.